I want to welcome you to this webinar of the Soul Repair Center. My name is Nancy Ramsay. I'm the director of the center located at Brite Divinity School on the campus of TCU in Fort Worth, Texas. I welcome you to our webinar series that is co-sponsored with the Volunteers of America Shea Moral Injury Center, directed by Dr. Rita Nakashima-Brock, a senior vice president for VOA, and founder and former director of the Soul Repair Center. The Soul Repair Center seeks to provide resources for religious leaders, VA and military chaplains, and civilian professional caregivers who support veterans and their families. This series provides information in areas of interest that are under-researched or for which information is not easily available, but important. Today's webinar provides a much-needed opportunity to hear from 3 experienced military chaplains about the challenges facing veterans following this country's departure from Afghanistan. It is clear that the emotional resonance of this withdrawal crosses generations of veterans who have served in combat, at least from Vietnam forward. Our speakers are Chaplain Major Jonathan R. Fisher, a veteran of 3 combat tours to Iraq as a U.S. Army chaplain. He currently serves as the director of the Center for Extended Clinical Pastoral Education for the Institute of Religious Leadership, Graduate School for Spiritual Care at the U.S. Army Chaplain Center and School at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. He's a board-certified chaplain and an ACPE certified educator. Michael Grubbs is a retired United States Air Force chaplain and colonel. He spent 11 years in the reserve, followed by 21 years of active duty. He completed 9 deployments, 7 times in support of Special Forces operations. Mike was awarded both an MDiv and a PhD in psychology. Following retirement, he practiced psychotherapy in a hospice environment. He's now retired and lives in Granbury, Texas. Reverend Kyle Fauntleroy, Captain of the United States Navy, retired, served in the Chaplain Corps in 2017 and currently serves as Director of Development at Brite Divinity School. For over 20 years, he served the Navy, Marines, and Coast Guard and their families around the world in periods of combat and calm. He is the only chaplain in Department of Defense history to hold both the positions of commanding officer and executive officer. Following the brief presentations by each of these chaplains, I will moderate an opportunity for them to be in conversation with each other, and then I will pose your questions from the chat. I want to remind you that in approximately 10 days to 2 weeks, the link for a recording of this webinar will be accessible at this site under the box titled Forthcoming Webinars. I also want to thank Sam McAllister, the skillful production staff person from VOA, who is assisting us today. And I want to thank the Reverend Dr. Alan Baruti, a Presbyterian minister and licensed marriage and family therapist, who has accompanied many veterans and their families in journeys toward healing. Alan is presently serving as the transitional general presbyter for Savannah Presbytery. He's a member of the Soul Repair Center National Advisory Board. And with that, I want to turn this over, first of all, to Chaplain Jonathan Fisher.
Thanks, Nancy. Thanks for having me and allowing me to be a part. Before I get going too far into this, there's a very important thing I'd like to talk about, and that is Kyle, I know is a Navy chaplain. I just wanted to identify with you for a second because as a Detroit Lions fan myself, I know the suffering that's going to happen for you when your team once again loses to Army. So I just want to say I'm available to you later if you'd like to have some spiritual care after the Army-Navy game this Saturday. So if you need them, I want you to know I'm here for you.
Touche. Thank you, dear brother.
Go Army, beat Navy, right?
Right on.
So today, before I get going too far into it, I wanted to acknowledge the fact that I'm an actively serving Army chaplain. And I've been doing this work for about 17 years. And so as such, it's important to note that for me, I'm going to be talking about moral injury from the perspective of the individual who's having an individual experience with their reaction to war, particularly the emphasis today is on Afghanistan. And sometimes conversations about moral injury can become moral judgments about particular political and military decisions that are made. And I want to emphasize that in no way during this conversation today am I engaging in a critique or a judgment of the commander-in-chief or the military above me that are making those decisions. I'm going to focus on the response of individuals. So I don't know if anybody has any questions later, they can ask me, but that's something important that I need to talk about. So from my position, I work mostly with chaplains now as an educator. I also still work with soldiers. I'm interacting in this conversation, I'm kind of interacting with the secondary trauma of chaplains who are ministering to those who are recently impacted by the withdrawal from Afghanistan at the end of that war. And I think it's important to note for me that there's really kind of two, I mean, there are a lot of categories, but there are two categories of folks who are experiencing what is kind of classically defined as moral injury. And that is those younger soldiers, Marines, airmen, who for them, this was their first experience of war. This is their first experience of combat trauma and death. And so for them, this is something they're interacting with in the here and now. This is not a back then conversation about, you know, how I'm feeling today about stuff that took place back then. It's very much a conversation of what is happening to me as I've experienced this. And then the second kind of category of folks that I've experienced are people like me. I am of that generation of officers that came in post 9/11. And for us, our careers have been defined by the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. For me, I never did get to Afghanistan. I did 3 deployments in Iraq as part of the regular army. So they were good long deployments, not the short ones. Just kidding. And myself, I formed as really in a lot of ways as an adult and as a practitioner in light of that. And so for those of us NCOs, officers whose life has been defined by those wars, one of the things that soldiers talk a lot about are, what has my service meant if we just left? So if I spent 20 years, then that means I've missed years of my life. I've missed my youth. I gave, in a lot of ways, I'll just speak for myself. I gave my youth to the Army, right? I gave my knees and my back. I spent years away from my children, from my spouse. And one of the things that certainly early in my career that I told myself is that, you know, this coming into the Army, this sacrifice, it's all worth it because we're serving the greater good and we are making the world a better place for freedom and democracy. And in all of these ways that I think we as a culture kind of minimize the impact of what's happening in order to make it so part of, I have a TBI, and part of that is sometimes I lose my train of thought and coming back to the moment. So it's a choice to miss out on stuff. So, I mean, emphatically, a choice to do one thing is a choice to not do something else. And so there's a lot of grief that's associated with that, right? So when things don't work out the way we thought they were supposed to, and certainly the way we have anchored ourselves, then there's a deep sense of disillusionment that takes place. Who am I and what is my personhood outside of that? I came from a culture that identified a person's value and worth, and a great deal in a sense of what's their connection to, what's their work connected to in terms of the divine and the divine's work in the world, or what is the work that they do? Does it matter? Does it have it make a difference in the world? And so I think many soldiers come into the Army. Of course, people come into the Army for all kinds of reasons. But underneath all of that, there's this sense of servanthood and this sense of the collective, that what we're doing matters. for the betterment of the world. And then somewhere along that line, we come face to face with the reality that it's much more complicated than that. So in my own journey through moral injury, as a youth, ideas of morality were very clear, very black and white. This is right and this is wrong. And I came into the Army with kind of that idea as well. And then I got to Iraq. And during Iraq, it became very clear to me that what was good and righteous and just wasn't as clear cut as I always thought it was. And so my work as a career officer, my work has been to anchor myself in my own values, to anchor myself in who I am as a person, as a cleric, and as an officer. And that's the work I seek to do with moral injury, with the chaplains that I work with, is to help them get really clear about who they are and what their morals are. A lot of times the younger soldiers that are coming in, just like young people around the world, are not really clear about, they don't see themselves as a moral person, a person who has a morality, and that morality interacts. And then as they get jobs and they start to do things become a little more morally ambiguous. And the paradox that exists, the tension that exists between, this is what I always thought the world was supposed to be, and this is the world as I see it and experience it, that tension can be really painful to work with. And some people just dive full in, they go one side or the other, right? And that's a way of dealing with the anxiety that rises within that tension. But what I do is to help people work with that tension, to help build some resilience, some emotional stamina around interacting with that tension as it arises. Recently, I was up in New York City. And while I was up there, I met with a friend of mine, Stephanie Kendall, who was the disciples minister up there. And Stephanie had a couple of her friends, one of which, Ann, is a New York City Fire Department chaplain. And I had mentioned that, because of the training I was at, I hadn't got to see the World Trade Center while it was, that site while it was open. So her friend, the fire department chaplain, makes some calls, right? She calls around and then tells us to go knock twice on the door and say the secret password. It was a whole complicated thing. And we got over there to the number 10 hook and ladder truck, which is the fire department space right there at ground zero. And, through a lot of conversation and so forth, one of the firemen said, "Hey, come with me." And we walked over. They took me right in past the roped off area to the site itself. And I don't know that I was quite ready for what was about to happen for me. So there I was, able to stand at the South Pool, and it's a big square and there's water and it kind of flows into this hole in the middle of it. And in that moment, I was overwhelmed with my sadness. In that moment, all I could see were the faces of soldiers who died by suicide, soldiers that I've known who died in combat, soldiers who drank themselves by self-coping, the years of suffering of my own and those around me kind of pouring into that pool. So I had to hold on. I was falling. I had to kind of hold on, and I composed myself and left. And reflecting back on that, my work personally has been around my sense of vocation, of who I am in this space, in a space where the mission of the Army, which is not necessarily to defend democracy, and the mission of the Army is not to do diplomacy, and the mission of the Army is not to nation build and make the world a better place and all that. The mission of the Army is to fight and win the nation's wars. And just as I came in face to face with that reality as a young chaplain, so soldiers also come face to face with that reality. And that can be an overwhelming experience. So what can a minister do? I think if you're a pastor outside of a military base and you've got soldiers and their family members coming in, one of the things that we're doing as a chaplain corps is focusing on building community, building better community. Because the person who's experiencing this kind of disillusionment and kind of that violation of what they thought was true about the world and where they are, they need community. They need to not be alone. And it can be, it's remarkable how the military can be such a communal experience, and it can also be kind of an isolating experience as well. So creating spaces for community to take place and creating spaces where a soldier or family member can be safe to kind of let down their guard a little bit and say some things that maybe they need to say, and being present with them. That's how I think you can really be of assistance to folks who are currently serving, who are struggling with what they're experiencing as moral injury. I think that sets my comments, and I'll look forward to hearing from the other presenters.
Good day to everybody. This is Mike Grubbs. I want to first thank Robert Ward, one of my fellow chaplains, for introducing me to Nancy Ramsay and for her invitation to speak with you today. I put the context of this conversation in the specifics of the title of this particular seminar in terms of the withdrawal from Afghanistan and how it affects us. The whole idea is, to me, of being forced to do something, required to do something, to be caught up into something by circumstances, and the sense of loss that people sometimes feel in their service as military members kind of draw the boundaries for what I want to talk about. My first experience with this particular topic of moral injury came long before there was a moral injury institute anywhere. I read a book decades ago by Father Mahady. He was a VA chaplain and had been drafted into Vietnam. And his book really spoke to me so much that I called him up, found him, called him up, and we actually spoke several times on the telephone. And he was talking about, all of the things that Mama taught him, don't hit, don't push, wait your turn in line. All the little rules that we grow up with that teach us the boundaries of being connected to other people were pretty much violated by what he experienced as an infantryman in Vietnam. And so where does that lead us? And to me, I think there's a huge intersection between the disciplines of mental health and ministry and chaplaincy. Because I think for me, life really boils down to 4 words: be connected and transformative. And I think I learned that really at a very young age as a pastor. I was a student pastor while I was still in seminary, and I had a man come to me. His wife was in the final stages of cancer, and they had a piece of property, and she wanted to build a place out in the country with a wraparound porch where she could watch the wildlife. And that's how she wanted to spend her final days. And he came to me. He was older than my father. And he said, well, I want your advice. Should I do this? And I thought, this is crazy. Why is he asking me? I'm just a snotty-nosed kid, relatively speaking. But there is a sense of connectedness between clergy and their parishioners that I don't think often makes its way to the therapy room. And I think that's a huge advantage of clergy. And I don't know current statistics, but years ago, when I was an active pastor, the statistics said that's where people go for help. So you're in a unique position to help people. And I think my experience, both as a pastor and a clinician, is what you do initially kind of sets up the successfulness of whatever you're doing, therapy, intervention, call it what you may. And I think sometimes we can inadvertently say the wrong thing. We can have good intentions. We may be trying to connect, but I think sometimes we might say something like, well, oh, that's terrible. That tends to be a way that sometimes people try to connect to that sense, that emotional sense, but that also might be catastrophizing. Everything in American society is catastrophized, or what I prefer to call monster size. You drive through the drive-through and they want to monster size your fries and monster size your burger and monster size your soft drink. But that's not necessarily helpful, I don't think, in a conversation. Try to find a way to join that neither catastrophizes nor overly internalizes. Oh, you have a really bad problem, because it's more than just them. We have this moral injury, and even other mental health diagnoses that are really more in the sense of community. There are many stories where people's environment was changed and their mental health disorder more or less disappears. So I think what an advantage moral injury framework has is that it talks about a context in which this occurred. The military life, and I know speaking to military chaplains, this doesn't come as news to you, but military's life is very different than any other environment you can be in the sense that you don't really have control over your environment. You're told what to do and you go do it. And I think that's very important to remember. And so there's that context again. And then I want to talk a little bit about some things in therapy that I think might be helpful as well. And that is, first, I'd like to focus on something Howard Stone introduced me to years before I went back and took initial training in psychology, and that's rational emotive therapy. It was began by a guy named Albert Ellis. I don't particularly care for Albert Ellis, but his thoughts, his framework was pretty good, and it spoke to me. One of the principles of irrational beliefs Albert Ellis identified is the idea that it is horrible when things are not the way we like them to be. That's that own internal catastrophizing of things. Sometimes we need to consider the environment, and we don't give ourselves a break because we focused on ourselves rather than the context in which it happened, that connectedness that we all experience. Also, I know it's not one of Nancy's favorite modalities for therapy, but I think there is some frameworks from cognitive behavioral therapy that we should think about. There are times when we, as people, begin to jump to conclusions, to exaggerate or minimize, to oversimplify, overgeneralize, mind read, or do emotional reasoning. But I think one of my favorite things to think about from the therapeutic world is narrative therapy, because narrative therapy, I think, is very simple to understand and fairly simple to apply as we speak to veterans or military members who are suffering. And narrative therapy, to think of it simply, is how do we change the final chapter of our life? We talk about what's happened, and a lot of times we become focused on the problem. But what narrative therapy says is, okay, this is what's happened. And if we continue down this line, we're going to end up with a final chapter of your book that looks like X. Now, is X what you want it to be? Well, no, it's not. I don't want to end up with being alienated and alone, for example. And so what do we need to change to make the final chapter what we want it to be? And I think that is a way of talking to a person who we continue down this line of self-recrimination and guilt. Where does that get you? And is that really where you want to go? And if not, how do we go about transforming that final chapter? I think, as Jonathan spoke about, sometimes in the military, there are constraints that are put upon us. It's part of our contract, if you will, with the military. But as a retiree, I feel much freer to speak about other things that have happened. But a lot of times in speaking with veterans or active duty members about problems, sometimes they really suffered from not understanding the bigger picture. And so many of the times when they saw things, they simply didn't really understand the complexity beyond their individual participation. And I think that's another area where sometimes, not always, but sometimes we have an opportunity to help people by broadening their perspective. I don't really have anything else, so I'm going to turn it over to Kyle.
Thanks, Mike. And I thank you for resurrecting the name of Howard Stone as well, a very influential professor who's still in the area, by the way. Anyway, I'd like to begin my remarks with a couple of verses out of Psalm 55. If an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If a foe were raising himself against me, I could hide from him. But it's you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend, with whom I had sweet fellowship as we walked together with the throng at the house of God. As we consider the topic of moral injury and veterans in the aftermath of the complete and relatively quick withdrawal from Afghanistan, I suggest we look at the impact of betrayal, broken promises, breach of trust, and perhaps duplicity within a culture that prides itself on the ideals of duty, honor, courage, commitment, dependability, reliability, and protection. The sense of betrayal that many veterans are experiencing. And then how do we care for them? The survivors of a 20-year war. Of course, we won't get to all we need to discuss here, but this is a good start, and I'm grateful to the Soul Repair Center under Dr. Ramsay's leadership and VOA's Shea Moral Injury Center and Dr. Rita Brock's leadership for this opportunity. And thank you all for your engagement here today. As Dr. Ramsay described my vocational life, please notice that she did not describe me as a scholar nor a clinician. I was a Navy chaplain, an ordained Christian minister who served military service members and their families in a variety of military settings and communities for 30 years. I retired in 2017. I'm therefore, to put it crudely, a jack of all trades and master of none. As Jonathan mentioned, I spent 27 of those 30 years caring for those who would train and fight in the Arabian Gulf and surrounding countries, to include Iraq and Afghanistan. So I prepared myself for this time with you by calling and checking up on some old friends, Marines, sailors, and soldiers, both active duty and retired. 12 to be precise. All spent multiple deployments in the fight against the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. Some are Purple Heart recipients. Most conversations occurred between the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and yesterday, the 80th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. As the son of a World War II naval officer, who served in the South Pacific, that has meaning for me. All 12 conversations touched on the same thing: broken promises, broken trust. But it wasn't just the breach of one government's commitment to another, or a commander's contradiction in the middle of a strategic, operational, or tactical plan. It was the breaking of one person's word to another. The guys I visited with, my friends with whom I served at one time or another, all developed relationships with Afghans, military and civilians. They developed relationships with allied combatants. And these vets believed that they betrayed their personal commitment to those with whom they fought, and they betrayed their warrior code, and therefore failed to live up to their moral responsibility to honor the dead and leave no one behind. Now, in order to preserve the sanctity of my conversation with these men, I've chosen to excerpt bits of an interview conducted by Vice News with 3 Marine Purple Heart recipients that was conducted on the 31st of April this year. If you'd like, you can see the entire interview on YouTube, entitled "Purple Heart Veterans React to the U.S. Withdrawal from Afghanistan." Their words in the excerpts I'm going to read accurately reflect the sentiments, and in some cases, the very words of the veterans with whom I visited. Marine number 1, quote, "The military leadership and the advisors to the president are cowards. They were straight scared to tell him no. You can't tell me that you're going to leave American lives, allies, and friends to fend for themselves. It's totally wrong. And it makes me, as an American, well, it makes me sad to be an American." Veteran number 2. "We removed ourselves in a way that doesn't make sense. We left millions of people destitute. Our country let them down. We made a promise to them. We made promises to them face to face. Individually, we made promises to them, and I think that's what really hurts the most. The people that we, our friends, died for are now having to relive some of the same horrors that we fought, and many of us died to change, and that's devastating." He continued, "I don't think the American population as a whole understands the sacrifice, the heart that we left over there. Imagine," he says, "imagine working and striving and fighting tooth and nail with your actual life every day, thinking that you're making a difference, and then one day you wake up and it's all gone. We will undoubtedly see veterans' lives lost because of this. We will undoubtedly see people commit suicide because everything that they fought for feels like it was in vain," he says. "Veterans are going to kill themselves because of this, and I don't think the men in suits are quite aware of that just yet." End quote. The interviewer asks, "Do you think it was all in vain?" The Marine answers, "Yeah, I do. You know, as someone who bled in that war, as all of us have, the guys that didn't come home, well, what are they? Why did they not come home? These are 19, 20, 21-year-olds who never got to come home, never got to start their lives, and we abandoned them. We abandoned those guys, and that's hurtful." Veteran number 3. "The only thing that wasn't in vain was fighting for each other." I tell my guys, I say, you know, the soldiers, the Marines, the people who fight the wars, the warriors, they're the ones who win the battles. It's the politicians who lose the war. He says, I always try to get them to remember that. In his remarks prepared for the U.S. Army's Fort Leavenworth Ethics Symposium in November, way back in 2010, Dr. Jonathan Shea wrote, quote, moral injury is the sum total of the psychological, social, and physiological consequences that a person undergoes when all three of these things are present. Number one, betrayal of what is right. Number two, betrayal of what is right by someone who holds legitimate authority. And number three, betrayal of what is right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high stakes situation. Dr. Shea continues, what's at stake clearly has links to the culture and social system, but must be present in the mind of the person suffering the injury. The stakes never get higher than they are in war, whether one's own death or maiming, or often more important, the death or maiming of a beloved comrade. The profession of arms creates and nurtures intensely personal relationships that last a lifetime. We saw this demonstrated yesterday at the Pearl Harbor commemoration, as the few, mostly wheelchair-bound survivors of the attack met for the first time as old friends, inextricably bound together by shared experiences of an 80-year-old event. An Army Ranger buddy of mine, who agreed to let me use some of our conversation, said over the phone, to say that everything we did was a waste of time, blood, and treasure no longer is the case. We don't have time for that. There are too many of us walking around. We have to reinvigorate those relationships. We have to remain trustworthy in the aftermath of broken trust. We know that our government doesn't understand military culture. We can't change that other than to get out and vote. We've got to advocate for one another. We've got to care for one another in personal ways, despite the physical separation provoked by the pandemic. We've got to exercise the compassionate intrusion our leadership training taught us years ago, he said, to get to know our people and to distinguish between what is interesting and what is important. How are we integrating vets into society, he asks. What are we doing to give vets a new mission? We have so many skill sets. We can be teachers and coaches and anything. We're great at problem solving and connecting resources to solve problems. After all, we're accustomed to belonging, to being part of something greater than ourselves. As a simple caregiver, I try to lend a non-judgmental ear to others, to address the interesting and deeply search for what is important. I tend to look for opportunities to try to connect my fellow vets to resources and organizations, especially those made up of those with similar experiences. I ask congregations and religious communities to make time and space for veteran gatherings. I guess that one way to cope with betrayal, in the words of the psalmist, betrayal by a close friend with whom I once enjoyed sweet fellowship, whether it be God, a person, or an authority, is to pursue patient, sustained, dependable trust. Trust that becomes almost predictable and grows into a new and covenantal relationship. It's my prayer that we will all give an ear to the voices of our veterans, to hear their distress and nurture them on their own terms back into the throng of the house of God. I'm looking forward to questions. Nancy?
Yes, I'm suggesting that I appreciate each of you presenting, and I want to start by inviting you all to pose questions to each other or to respond to what you've heard from each other in these very moving comments. And then I'll come through with some questions from others.
Oh, I thought your presentation was excellent. That whole ideal of shared experience, which to me speaks to the deep connection which military members have to make with one another. And I would ask you, how do we, in the civilian aspect of our life, post-military, find those deep connections which sustained us through some of the hardest times in life?
That's a tough question, Mike, because I'm not sure that I'm through with the transition yet. But you know where I ran into it unexpectedly. When I ran into it first was at the VA clinic getting batteries for my hearing aids. And there's a canteen, there's a little snack bar. Yeah, buddy. There's a snack bar at the VA hospital here in Fort Worth. So once I started milling around, from time to time, I'll leave the Divinity School and go have lunch over there by myself, just so that I can be around those guys, those folks. You know, I joined the American Legion, the VFW, and all that stuff, but I haven't dared set foot there yet, and I don't know why. Jonathan, you may have to help me with that, but go ahead.
One of the things that comes to my mind is how often I find myself with people who are, you know, going from transitioning out. And that is a very tenuous time, the time of reintegration, because in a lot of ways it is a sort of reintegration with society writ large. One of the things that comes up for me is how some of the reason that we have such close bonds with one another in our service is because of the shared suffering. I mean, that's what it is. We're all in the suck together, right? Like, you know, and consequently, it sometimes people look for relationships. Well, you can't really reproduce that. One thing that can be done, and what I encourage those who are transitioning to do, is to connect themselves through volunteering at organizations where they can find a mission. I read a really interesting article this last week, or maybe it was Monday. I don't know. You know, sometimes my days run together. About transitioning veterans and how susceptible they can be to extremism. And one of the reasons that the VA was offering that this happens is when a veteran leaves military service, they don't have another mission to go to. And so they become a target for people who will, you know, they'll offer them a mission and they'll offer them community. And for me, I hear in that a task to all of us to actively seek out. I mean, there's a responsibility of the veteran leaving to engage themselves, and there's a responsibility for everyone to reach out and be connected. Somebody made a mention in the comments I noticed about prison And as part of my work, I spent 3 years as the staff chaplain at the United States Disciplinary Barracks on Military Corrections Facility at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, which is the Department of Defense maximum security prison. And I think, I'm not sure about the answer to the question as far as any research has been done, but what is really fascinating to me is I think you're onto something really important. And that is, there's something that the corrections world can teach us in terms of putting together systems that can help a person integrate, right? Because the Army is a big system. That's what it is. It's a big system that runs everything. I mean, I can't speak about the Navy or the Air Force, but I just know my world is a system. And when that system kind of shuts down, like a person leaves, they retire, and it really doesn't matter how great they were or how important they were. On the other side of the retirement door, the Army just keeps on rolling, right? The Army keeps rolling along. And sometimes people get lost in that shuffle. And I think there's something there. I'd be interested to hear what y'all have to think about that idea. I guess I'll be more clear. That systems are set in place so that when an inmate is released from prison, they have a system to go to that can be, and those systems, frankly, are in place for a lot of veterans. Whether or not a person utilizes them is different. But
I think I found a mission right after I got out. I went to work for a general office of the church. So I had, I don't know, 30 days to move and start my new job. I think I wish I'd taken longer. I wish I'd have sat in the aftermath for a while. I wish I'd just been in a place without something to do, to think, to PT, to think, to pray, to meditate before starting out on something new. Because I think we find that with retirees that their first job after getting out is not their last job. Obviously, that's why I'm here now. So it's not that I had a bad experience at the last job. It's just that I'm here now.
You know, what comes to me, Kyle, is something I hear from folks who have separated. And I'm kind of relating this back to pastors in their churches. What can I do to help a veteran? Well, one thing is reach out. You know, I can say that as a exennial, I think I am an exennial. We visit a lot of churches, and it is remarkable to me how few churches ever follow up with me when I visit. Even when I give them my information, nobody calls me, nobody emails me, you know, like I've got to go chase them down. And I'm a very high functioning person who wants to be engaged. And so I think there's an applied, I'm not saying that's true for everybody, but there is a task there. I think that certainly the church can be involved with is how can we be a light and reach out and not, reach out again and again.
Yeah.
I think you hit on the ideal of shared suffering. And maybe that was part of the reason why I was attracted to working in hospice post-military. I got out on a medical discharge after 32 years of service. And there was this sense of many connections post-military are fairly superficial. But I found when people are in death and dying situations, maybe it's that concept of shared suffering, and we don't really we don't celebrate suffering in our everyday life, and maybe we should, because maybe that's a chance to make connections. I can't remember the name of the priest that wrote the book, but he says we relate to each other not in our perfections but in our imperfections. And maybe it's that suffering and not necessarily knowing the answer to our suffering that allows us to connect so deeply in combat situations.
You know, I like to coach junior NCOs, non-commissioned officers. That vulnerability calls vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
They can be a real, authentic person. Their soldiers will be more real and authentic with them. Not in the sense that they got to go. A great book on this subject is Brene Brown's Dare to Lead. But not that they need to like tell all their secrets or whatever. But the context of I'm a real human being having a real human experience, and modeling that to folks. You know, a lot of the Gen Z. I saw a statistic just this last week that Gen Z is noted as one of the loneliest generations in recorded history, and people, you know, I take the approach with when I'm training junior chaplains and so forth too. That sometimes you got to teach people how to be, and teach people how to grow and develop, and kind of come into a sense of who they are. I know when I was 18, I didn't have a sense of who I was.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I jump in here for a moment with an observation. Some of the folks in the chat are commenting on the grief, the thread of grief and sadness through your comments and the comments that you've shared from others. And it brings to mind the idea of lamentation, and that what folks who lament call for is a witness, not necessarily a change agent, but someone who will hear deeply that grief. And I wonder how that resonates with what your experience is, both as yourselves, veterans of these wars, and also as someone who's listened deeply to others, especially in the aftermath of Afghanistan.
Well, what comes up for me, and even in my own therapeutic journey, spiritual direction as well, is sometimes I just need the space to say the words, right? And I think about, I mean, lament is there's a whole liturgy, I suppose I can go with that. But for me in my own journey, and both as a spiritual care provider, as well as just a person living my life in the Army, what is so helpful is a place to say the words and to own the hurt, which is true with a lot of grief work. I think for me, I just taught a class yesterday about grief and loss, and there are a lot of things that are socially acceptable in the world around us. Emotions like anger, fury. I've heard a lot of that. And what Kubler-Ross tells us is that when you can work through that anger and work through that fury and work through that bargaining, that there's often a depression that comes when that anger gets turned inward. And I think initially coming out of Afghanistan, that's what I heard a lot of, was just a lot of fury and rage. And then that rage has kind of settled into a depression. And with those who I've worked with who've kind of come to acceptance, like the path that takes is lamenting what was or what may never be, and coming into some sense of, okay, so who am I today? In light of what I've experienced, who am I today? And yeah, I have some thoughts on trust, but I want to stay with this idea for a bit.
We see if either Kyle or Mike wants to comment on that.
I think lamentation is an excellent framework to talk about what happens in the military. My own experience at one installation is we had an Army tenant unit that had a combat surgical hospital and a chaplain of one. And he asked us for assistance and we gave it. So once or twice a week, there would be mass casualties that came in, and under his direction as the hospital chaplain, we each took a role. And my role was the expectants. And for those of you who are not familiar with triage in the military context, expectants are those that only receive pain medication while they die, because there's not enough resources in theater to save that particular individual. So I've sat with many people and watch them die as they received minimal medical care. And I think that concept of lamenting things not yet done together, things that were done that were perhaps I wronged someone else, relationships that didn't work out. There's so many ways in which lamentation applies to my own life, and it is meaningful to me. But as I think about the scripture, and I'm a Christian minister, so I speak of scripture in that context, the lamentations usually end, though, a little bit different. There's a crying out, and in the end, there's a sense of peace. But I think the hardness, the difficulty is for many people to listen to the lament part. It's hard sometimes for us to share each other's pain. I remember one time at the hospital, I got called at Lackland to the hospital in the middle of the night. A baby had died, and the nurse kept checking on me and the mother because we were in a little room with the baby's body. And at the end, she said, nobody's ever sat with anybody for 3 hours. And I said, well, I went through that myself. And so, trust me, 3 hours is nothing compared to the journey that's ahead of her. And I think it's tough because lament, that period of anger or depression is not short-lived. It's not really a diagnosis. It's the human condition.
It's what?
The human condition.
Well, yeah.
We all have pains. We all have sorrows. We all have regrets. That if you don't have those things at some point in your life, I don't know how to connect with you.
Yeah. Kyle, do you have any thoughts about that?
I tend to go to the Psalms as language for lamentation, mostly. I mean, I did it today. And I think the Psalms give me a language that I don't normally possess and don't normally articulate. And whether it's grief, abandonment, anger, or joy, I think it gives me, it helps me name where I am spiritually and emotionally. It's hard for me to stay in my head much. I was doing really good preparing this presentation for a while. And then, as Jonathan said, looking into the pool in New York, I got a lot of visits all of a sudden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they were mostly good, but I still miss those guys.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think of the ones, I think of survivors too, from my time at the Warrior Transition unit in Kuwait, where we were the first part of the redeployment process for folks coming out of the fight. And we had a lot of wounded come through. But they were walking wounded. But I tried to stay in my head, but it just didn't work. I kept, we'd just sit and I'd let them weep, and then I'd go find a place where I could weep for them. Right. And it was always the language of the psalmist that would come to me.
Right.
So I don't know if that answers the question or not.
I think one thing I want to just offer the group as a whole, and I'm not talking about the group, I'm talking about everybody here and everybody who's watching, and that is how vitally important it is to work your own lamentation. When you experience someone who is working their lamentation, you don't work yours out on them.
Yeah.
And
It's true.
sometimes as a person, I've been in the situation where people ask me all kind of questions, and what's very clear to me is that they've got some unfinished business with their own suffering, and they're wanting to borrow some of mine to help work out theirs.
Yeah.
Which I'm okay to do sometimes, but not all the time. And
Right.
so for the veteran community, those and the active community maybe is giving some space and just work out your stuff so that you can be present to work out their stuff. Is what I'd offer.
I want to shift us in just a moment to more focus on the many questions from over 100 folks that are on this webinar with us. But I want to go back to my question about lamentation because I'm thinking particularly about the work of a couple of scholars. I'm thinking about Kathleen O'Connor's remarkable commentary on Lamentations, where she underscores the importance of listening to the lament as someone who feels utterly alone and whose very identity, very personhood is at risk. And the importance then of the courage, Levinas calls it stepping into the half opening to bear witness to the humanity of that person's suffering. And that in doing so, we of course risk some of our own comfort, obviously, but what's at stake is affirming the personhood, the value of that person's life, and in the kind of isolating way that grief and deep pain can create. And I think that might be useful as I've listened to y'all's descriptions, your descriptions of your own grief and your hearing from others. That's not the whole thing, but it does seem to me valuable in thinking through just the role of bearing witness. As Mike talks about, 3 hours of bearing witness to the value of the life of the child that won't be, and the grief of the mother. And I hope, Jonathan, when I just want to say that I grieve what you described about religious leaders. Part of the purpose of this, of the Soul Repair Center, is to provide resources for those religious leaders. So maybe we're lucky and some are here today. But I'm grateful for the ways you all have been able to give voice to the grief of others, and grief that includes not only their own personal loss, but what our country, who we are. Interestingly, that's going to be part of what we talk about in January, looking at moral injury from a societal frame, and as well as an individual one. There are many questions that have come up on the chat, and
there is one at the bottom that I want to make sure.
All right, go for it. Now I realize you can see it. Go for it.
Yeah, so I can see this one. Edgardo Torres talks about, well, what about folks that don't believe in God? How do you connect with them? And what I want to do, Eduardo, is really encourage you to embrace a concept that comes to us from the multicultural literature, which is in some ways we're like everybody. We're humans having a human experience. And in some ways we're like a lot of people, right? I'm a white guy from West Michigan who is an army soldier and so forth, right? So in some ways I'm like a lot of people, but there's some real differences there. And then in some ways I am unique. I am who I am, right? And so that same idea translates for me into a sense of spiritual care. So when I think about, well, people don't believe in God, okay, it's really neither here nor there, because there is a way in which all human beings are having a spiritual experience on the earth.
Right.
And I think the path, particularly Eduardo and everybody, the path to this is through suffering. It's through coming to terms with your own suffering so that you can deal with the anxiety that arises when you start to experience the other suffering. I really encourage you. You don't have to be a veteran to help veterans.
Right.
You don't have to be a person who's, experienced being not housed to be able to be present with someone who's also having that experience. Like, you got to work, because suffering is suffering. And somebody said something about war. Is war different? I think that suffering is suffering. I mean, when you're in the shit, you're in the shit, if I could be really real. And regardless of what kind of smell that particular stuff has, if you can work with yours, you can be present in theirs. That's my thought. I don't know if somebody else.
Well, in lamentation, for example, is a human experience.
That's right. Yes, it is.
You know, 100%. It is not necessarily. It's useful in religious context, but it's a human response. There's a comment from one person about that implies the value of more than individual responses, and it makes me wonder about what do you think about the value of groups for veterans, where they can gather, where it's safe, where they feel they can be heard and understood? Are you aware of how that might be useful at VA and other contexts?
Groups have ups and they have downs. Mm-hmm. As Jonathan just said not long ago, you don't have to be a veteran to help a veteran, and I'm totally with Jonathan in that. But there is that shared experience that veterans have of suffering in a particular kind of way that may be helpful. But I wouldn't want to overemphasize veterans groups, because I think it was Henry Allen I was trying to think of earlier in the Wounded Healer. We're all wounded. Yeah. But I think, as Jonathan alluded to, there are times I have to suspend my woundedness to tend to someone else's woundedness. Yeah. That doesn't mean that I'm completely healed and normal and well or whole, but for a moment I can suspend my own pain, my own disconnection, and allow that other to have that time. And I think the whole idea of Christian or believer versus non-believer doesn't change what Nancy, you spoke about with utterly alone, because utterly alone and connected is a continuum all of us travel on.
Oh, I like that, Mike, where you're going with that. I agree with what he's saying around groups. So one of the things I experience sometimes with the veteran community, and again, I work mostly with active duty folks, but one of the things I've noticed about even soldiers and those who have recently left is that there's a way in which we kind of do a group think, because it's kind of the nature of the service, and we start to idealize our suffering, and it becomes more indifferent than everybody else's. And for my money, I really encourage veterans not just to engage with each other in veterans groups, but also to engage with everybody living a human life in a human place. Yeah. You know, I don't know the trauma of getting a bill from the insurance company for a medical procedure that I had to have that's $500,000, and thinking, where in the world am I going to come with that? I mean, that the doctor's supposed to help you. And yet when you go to the hospital, you're going to be paying for that for the rest of your life, and the only way I get in touch with that is to be around folks who don't have TRICARE and might have those kinds of experiences. Yeah. If that makes sense.
I've gotten an encouragement to remind folks that have come on since the beginning that there'll be a recording of this webinar available at the most in 2 weeks at the site of the Soul Repair Center, and also at the VOA site. One person has asked about their work at a VA center working with Vietnam veterans, and the ways they continue to process that war. And wondering about the parallels that are folks that are a part of the Gulf Wars in Afghanistan.
Say that question again, Nancy.
I'm inviting. This is a comment from a VA chaplain who's observing what the chaplain suspects will be parallels between the conversations this chaplain has with the processing of Vietnam veterans, excuse me, and those of these recent wars?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is a sense of unfinishedness. I mean, I think this war was longer than the Vietnam War by a matter of minutes, maybe. But I think not having been able to finish the mission in terms that we expected when the fight began. Maybe that's one way, and trying to deal with that and the value of our efforts not coming to an expected fruition. Does that make sense?
I would add the loss of meaning. I went there for a purpose. I went there for a reason.
Yeah.
And withdrawal, and what does it all mean anymore? Why all this sacrifice and pain and suffering, and for what?
I don't wonder if that is a common experience across the board. You know, sometimes we write a story, the legend grows out of a particular war. World War II is a great example, right? Where, it was all worth it because fill in the blank. And these stories we tell ourselves helps us kind of make meaning of that, right? And sometimes that was helpful. Sometimes I'm not sure that it is.
Well, it may be a false belief that there should be meaning.
Oh, thank you. I love that. You hit it, Mike. This idea that when we can tie it up with a bow, we can all say we did a good thing, right? And we can all agree that this is a great thing. And when in reality, war is always traumatic and it is always destructive, and war destroys. That's what war does. And maybe that's what's necessary. I often think about war happens when human beings cease to be able to interact with one another.
You gave a definition earlier of the Army, and of course, this is not the official definition of DOD, but I always thought the mission was to kill people and break things.
No, it's definitely officially to fight and win America's wars.
Yeah.
Got it.
And sometimes we lose track of that because, frankly, we use the Army for all kinds of things because it's huge and it has money, and the Army's out and about doing all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, that is the purpose of the Army. And I think a lot of soldiers who come in, I'm going to be a lab tech. That's what I'm going to do, And then they, get deployed and get put in a Humvee, and they're a door gunner now because that's where they can be. Because at the end of the day, every soldier, the only person that doesn't do that is the chaplain.
Right.
I'm wondering how you all would make suggestions to other chaplains that are watching this webinar and that are responding to persons, if there's something else you haven't said yet. But I'm also wondering what you would say to religious leaders that may be listening to this. And finally, I'm thinking about the many groups of veterans around the country and ways that you would want them to hear from your experience that might be of use as they try to process, probably including different generations of veterans, possibly, in those groups.
I'd want to reiterate what Jonathan mentioned earlier to chaplains, is to remember your vocation, remember your calling. To focus on that. To civilian church leaders, know that we are caring for souls just like you are, but in a different venue. We came from the church and we will return to the civilian church. we care for souls just like you do. We just do it in lethal environments sometimes. Guys, help me.
Well, what I would offer here, Kyle, is to kind of put a finer point on what you're saying, is that what always gets us through the storms of life is a good foundation. Yeah. It's an anchoring moment. And I'm a liberal progressive chaplain in a highly conservative world. And so sometimes, I mean, all of the chaplains I train generally tend to be much more conservative than me. Sometimes they're a little afraid, like, are you wanting to make me a liberal or whatever? And I always tell them, you need to be you, and you got to be clear about you, about who you are and what holds you in. Because I tell you, it's a lot of times working with someone who's in the thick of it, who is experiencing the kind of the waves of guilt and shame that kind of rolls over them. They become like a drowning person, and they start grasping for anybody around them. Make sense of my life, please. You gotta. And the minister, the pastor who is firmly grounded in their sense of vocation and their sense of calling and who they are and what they're about, is the person that can deal with that when it shows up. So if you're going to spend energy, spend it on making sure you're correct when you show up.
I think what I would say to both chaplains and civilian clergy and anybody else who's listening is that being a part or not being a part of the military neither qualifies you nor disqualifies you from helping people with moral injury. I think what qualifies you is to be willing to suspend your own suffering, to listen to theirs, and to be a part of their life, and to see it not as a burden, but a privilege that is extended to you for someone to become real and open and sharing their pain.
Nancy, were there other questions?
Oh, I asked you, I mean, if you were, I had several questions in the last question that I raised. And as I'm watching the chat, part of what I'm aware of is that there's a lot of people who are experiencing just the sadness, the level of grief that you all are reflecting on.
I want to stay with that for a moment, Nancy, because that's kind of a newer thought for me. I certainly have done a lot of work with grief, but making the connection of grief work and moral injury work, there's a lot of intersection there. And that's becoming more and more evident to me in our conversation here.
Mm-hmm. Kyle?
I'm still pondering that. I just noticed that somebody that I greatly admire, who knows a lot about grief, is a part of our group. Chaplain Bigger, welcome. You honor us with your presence, sir. It's good to see you. And I think grief's not managed alone for me. I have people around me that help me with grief, principally my family, and secondarily folks at church, not necessarily the staff because they've got enough to do. But I have, when we talk about groups, I have groups that help me attend to grief and grieving, and then out of the blue, I'll get a call from an old chaplain who wants my advice on something about the chaplain corps, and my heart just perks right up because I there's value there, even though because we had a shared experience like you discussed earlier, Jonathan and Mike. So there's still a mission, and the mission helps me manage the grief, because grief sneaks up on me from time to time, no matter what I do.
Yeah.
Is that getting to where you were going, Jonathan?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, I like that. I like that because grief touches grief, you know.
Yeah.
Underneath. So when I experience someone who's just really angry and they're just so angry, and the president this and the politicians that, and I just wonder what's underneath all that rage. And oftentimes it is a deep well of sadness, a lot of unfinished business. I saw in the chat this idea of unfinished is a theme, and unfinished stuff. We carry that with us, and sometimes we're not aware of it, right? I mean, Fritz Perls,
yeah.
kind of floating down there, and then sometimes it pops up out of nowhere, and there it is. And when it pops up for me, it might pop up for someone else, and that's that kind of both and. I want to help the people I'm with, but I got to work with my stuff so I can do that.
We're coming toward the close, and I wonder if there are particular things that you, as you've listened to each other, as you've watched the chat from panelists, that you want to leave with those who are watching, many chaplains who are watching, and some religious leaders, some hospital chaplains. What's the most important thing, do you think, or some of the important things for them to take as they're bound to be listening to others?
So I have something I'd like to offer the group, and that is one of the things that is in moral injury is when a person experiences an event that their response to that is to stop trusting someone, right? Trust gets broken. And there's a lot of energy spent in our society, and certainly in leadership, literature, and so forth around, well, you got to build trust. And here's what I learned as a prison chaplain that I think helps inform what I'm about to offer you here. And that is, what I learned as a prison chaplain is that the harder I tried to convince someone to trust me, it had an opposite effect. If I say to them, hey, trust me, you can trust me with your story, right? The more someone tells me to trust them, the less I trust them. The only thing I can really do is be trustworthy. And, I experience a lot of hand-wringing about, well, people don't trust the institutions, and people don't trust churches, and they don't trust pastors, and whatever else. And there's a lot of truth to all of that. But what I know is that I am a trustworthy person. And that as I am trustworthy, and that I seek to establish the organization that I am a part of right now, it's the Center for Extended CPE, as a trustworthy system, then people will start to trust. And in a world where there's just so much disconnection, the question I constantly ask myself is, am I trustworthy? Am I a trustworthy entity? Am I trustworthy with the taxpayer dollars? Am I trustworthy with the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines that are, the resources of this country? And am I a trustworthy entity to those around me? And the more I focus on that, being trustworthy, what I find is that those who have experienced moral injury, they start to be attracted to that because they know Fisher's a lot of things, but he is who he says he is. And that's something I'd offer the group.
Yeah. Just I be authentic in your walk alongside others. Don't expect them to be who you want them to be. Expect them to be themselves, and encourage them to be themselves. That to walk in the image of God they were created to be, not that you created them to be. And just be yourself alongside of them. My whole ministry in the Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard was just, my wife said, you're a mediocre preacher, you're a horrible administrator, but you hang out really well. And just hang out with folks and be with them and grieve when they grieve and laugh when they laugh. And that's what I miss most about the military. Mike.
One of the things that dawned on me as y'all were speaking was I worked in an environment where we did a 50-minute an hour, and then I worked in another environment where we did 25-minute sessions. And something that happened in both is that during the first session, often people would just kibitz and they would talk about really stuff that was irrelevant. And right before the end of the session, they would let the cat out of the bag. And I've always kind of thought the reason they did that is because it gives them an opportunity to leave before the cat's out of the bag. It's hard. Just put yourself in that other person's shoes. If you're going to go in and talk about your deepest hurt or your biggest failure or your largest rejection, it's hard to open that. And this ideal of being trustworthy, it's not going to be developed in 5 minutes. You know, Howard Stone again, achieve rapport. That's the first thing, achieve rapport. Well, you're not going to achieve rapport in 5 minutes. But an advantage of the chaplain world is that often you've known these people days and days and weeks before they reach out to you. So you're building trust even when you don't know that you're building trust when you work in those kind of situations where you have ongoing connection with the servicemen and women in charge.
And I think the thing, what I hear in that, Mike, is to keep reaching out.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a veteran you're aware of in your community, and you know what, they don't look like you. Boy, maybe they're rough around the edges, and you tried, you gave it your best shot, and they were really surly at first. And I just encourage you to keep trying, keep reaching out.
I remember an atheist at a base and he came to me right up front when I was first assigned the unit. I'm an atheist. I don't have any use for you. Oh, okay. That's fine. So we would talk in the hall, you know, chit chat, casual conversation from time to time. Unfortunately, he was in a 2-flight that had a fatal mishap, and they were away from the installation. And I flew out to where they were at to gather up the survivors and bring them back to home station. And he had he's taken me off my feet more than any other person in my life. He came over and he hugged me and he said, "I knew you would come for me." You know, that's human connection. It's not about you believing the way I believe, because that just doesn't happen. It's about caring and loving and walking with people and trying to be connected in whatever ways they'll.
That's probably a good way to draw this to a close, Mike. And I want to express appreciation to all three of you for sharing deeply from your experience and also from your own hearts, and appreciate the questions that our participants left in the chat. And I'm especially glad that our next webinar in January asks a question about moral injury from a societal frame, because part of what I wonder about is what would be different if these wars had been owned by the citizenry of this country instead of really a small number of citizens serving in them. Maybe that's something we can pick up then. But for now, I want to thank you for sharing deeply from your own hearts and from the deep experience that you brought to this. We're grateful. Thank you. And thank you all. I want to remind you that this webinar will be available as a recording in about 2 weeks.